Hi everyone. I'm sure everyone is here today to listen to Gilles, but I'm just going to take 5 minutes to kind of explain why we're having this talk here inside the DBS Singapore Gallery. So for those of you who, I guess, was in Singapore 5.5 years ago when we opened, this exhibition is actually the first time an account of art history in Singapore included 19th century photography. Before, any art historical account of Singapore art kind of started over there with painting in the 1920s forward. And when we opened with this inclusion of 19th century photography, we had questions, of course, from curators, from scholars, from art lovers about why this was present in this narrative of art history in Singapore. And the answer was because the invention of photography essentially changed the way people saw the world. And Gilles will speak about this, I think, quite extensively in today's talk. Photography changed the way we visualize the world, it changed the way we imagine the world, the way we communicate, and the way images circulated. So this impact was, of course, not just on us, but on artists as well. So what we saw in its influence on the entire Singapore Gallery is this new way of seeing and engaging with the world, and that's why we wanted to include 19th century photography into this particular exhibition. And I mean, it was, I guess, almost 90 years ago, or around 90 years ago, when Walter Benjamin said something that I really enjoy, which is that the question, and this was in 1930, not today, the question is not whether photography is art. Like that, to him, by the 1930s was over. The question is whether art is photography. And he's not talking about photography as the photograph, that piece of paper, but photography in the way that it revolutionizes, I guess, the way we see things. And photography as in terms of its reproduction, photography in its class consciousness. So in contemporary terms, I think that question is even more relevant, is art photography, not is photography art. And I think we come to that sort of towards the end of today's talk, but it's something that you can keep in mind throughout the day. Yes, if he gets through his many slides. So Gilles, as many of you know, has done extensive research on French photographer Jules Itier, and I would actually call him not just the expert in Singapore, but the expert internationally on Itier. And I'm going to hand the time over to him with I'm just going to click on that first slide. But before I do that, I just want to introduce the one and only Itier work we have in the National Collection. So this is Daguerreotype from 1844. And it's the view of Singapore from Government Hill, which is today's Fort Canning. And this is the oldest photograph in the National Collection. And it's, the only one by Itier we have. Gilles is very familiar with this work.
It could be the one, actually, the oldest of the whole of Asia. Because it could be one day before
the other one,
the Tian Ho Keng. Yeah.
So anyway, I'm just going to hand this time over to Gilles, who's going to introduce his interest in Itier as well as who Itier was.
Okay, thank you, Charmaine. Actually, I mean, what you say about why that question of why that gallery, when you reopened the gallery of Singapore art history, I think there's something for the future, there's something to do in terms of curatorship with what I'm doing here. I mean, the fact that photography really enters Asia here, which is East, Mid, West, so on. Okay, so I think there's something that could be done with like a long-term curatorial perspective, whereby if there is a photo gallery in the National Gallery of Singapore, it's because that's where modernity kick-started for the whole of Asia. And that is, okay, so that view of the government here, it kick-started my whole passion for Itier. I will say, I'm going the other way. Voila. So here we are. On the left, Jules Itier in the self-portrait 1842, down in Paris, and myself, at the feet of the bust of Alexander the Great in Alexandria. That was at the end of the trip to Egypt last year, which was like really completing the whole cycle of research on the ground for Itier. I'm working on the catalogue raisonné of Itier, and right now we have 118 images by Itier or attributed to Itier, because there's been a number of images that were attributed to him, for which in fact he was not the author. And the whole saga started with that one daguerreotype of, incidentally, the actual title by Itier's hand at the back of the plate is View of the Commercial Town. Okay, don't know how it got retitled View from Government Hill, but just, okay, like what's written at the back is View from of the Commercial Town, which happened to be in the National Gallery in 2006, I think the 2005. National Museum, 2005. So that was at about the same time as I started a photography course for ADM, the Art Design and Media in NTU. That was the first photo history course in Singapore at the tertiary level. And 2007, there was very little literature on photography history in Asia. Here you have the titles of the book that were, you see, I mean, there was something that John Falconer had published, The Vision of the Past, 83. There was a small, very small thing on Indonesia from 91. And the rest was, Japan had, of course, because Japan has a long photo history. So Japan had some specialists, but a lot of the literature was in Japanese. And so the things concerning China, India, and so on were done after that. As I was developing the class, the books were coming in. So, and here, hold on. Yeah. Here, and in the history book which I was using, there was one daguerreotype of Jules Itier. And it was a reproduction of that photograph of the treaty, the signatories of the Treaty of Whampoa, the first treaty between France and China, signed on a ship, a French steamer, off the island of Whampoa, south of Guangzhou. So it was a daguerreotype really recording the historical event. And it was in that photo history book because it was one of the earliest photographs of the recording of a historical event. Now, the one thing that really struck me is Treaty of Whampoa. Hold on, wait a minute. I'm Whampoa. I've been living in Whampoa. Whampoa is part of my life. I arrived in 81 and it became part of my life in 82. I moved there to live in Whampoa in 96, okay? So wait a minute, what's going on? The first treaty between France and China is Whampoa, and my life in Singapore is based in Whampoa. Another thing that really triggered, so the interest for Itier started like really triggering. I started researching better, and I went to his grave. And surprise, surprise, his grave was framed by two graves with my family name. He originated from the same region as my father. So there was something like really striking in the way his stuff in France was basically the same as mine in France. And his stuff in Asia, like the trip he did around the South Asian Sea, was the same stuff as the one I had for the 20 years of traveling around Asia. I'm going to die with that thing. So there was something between the way his map of the world and my map of the world was superimposing exactly, was something really striking. And that led me into research that became, it went on for 10 years, more. It's still going on. It really involves many different aspects of what I am, what I do, what I look for. Research on photography, time, space, and colonialism, because what strikes me at some point is that he was doing that trip just at the onset of modernity, full-fledged colonialism, globalization, and I was doing the same thing at a time where we were kind of like really wondering, how are we going to get out of that mess? So there was something between the two of us which needed to begin. That's his chronology. That's a bust that was in the property, which we talk about later. But more than the chronology, what is important is actually who was he? Like, what kind of man he was. The thing that really topped the whole, there will be 4 points. The one which is really at the top, because that defined his position and his career and what he did in life, is that he was a custom officer for the French government. And that was really overtaking everything else. His dedication to the job, to the career, was such that it defined all his life. He never pretended to be a photographer or whatever. He was, first of all, a custom officer. Then, second, is that he's a highly knowledgeable amateur scientist. He's amateur, yes, but he's highly knowledgeable, particularly in geology. He published books in geology and natural science, but as in the case of these learned men of the 19th century, knowledge could still include a lot of different things. Anything that was physics, technology was really interesting to him. And that is something that defines the content of all the journey that he's going to embark on. Now, from the point of view of belief, ideology, he's a very interesting mix, contradicting mix of both being a Republican, really ardent Republican, and a Catholic. So that makes a very interesting combination, because on the one hand, the Catholicism is really about all the tradition of the French culture, which usually is rather associated to aristocracy and like that kind of the right-wing kind of the spectrum. But on the other hand, is also very ardently a Republican, which is more of the white left side of the spectrum. And it's really interesting in the journal on how he bounces from one to the other, depending on the situation, depending on the people he meets. At some point he will be on one side of the thing, which is like really that fervent French, like he definitely has that vision that France has a mission colonizing, not colonizing, it's civilization mission to accomplish, civilizing mission. So it's all those elements that guide him and that makes his personality at work on the ground. And the daguerreotype became a tool that was allowing him to visualize and record all those elements that makes him. So that's his grandfather, and he's born in a family of custom officer. So it's some sort of aristocracy. I discovered that there is an aristocracy of the custom office in France. Okay, so he was born in that kind of family. This is the Serre, which is the village from where the family originated. He was born in Paris, but very quickly went to study in a lycée in Marseilles, where his uncle, who was a custom officer, was posted. And his uncle, incidentally, was part of the Bonaparte mission to Egypt. His uncle was one of the first Egyptologists Okay? So he grew in that kind of environment with somebody who was one of the first Egyptologists. So that gave him that taste for everything which was to the house. Breathing. So from there on, I need more water. From there on, he will be in Provence. I mean, he will be based in Provence his whole life. He will never go back to Paris. I mean, Paris is not kind of place I wish he had. So he will start as a simple officer, and he will have a few different postings. 1839, there is the announcement of the daguerreotype in Paris, and it's somewhere in the north of France and in Belley. It's in Belley when the daguerreotype is announced in Paris. And he's going to, of course, be a subject of that, what is called the daguerreomania. Okay? There are texts about how from one day to the next, the streets of Paris were full of people with a daguerreotype at the corner of the street. And there was a sudden surge, there's a craziness for that revolutionary medium. And he's going to use it as well. The self-portrait of 1842. Here, a few dates about the coming of photography to Asia. 1840 material is for sale in Calcutta. You can buy daguerreotype material in Calcutta in 1840. And 41, it's already as far as Sydney. And there are two views of Paris by Itier, done in 42, together with the self-portraits. And the others view, okay, because a bit like the daguerreotype of Daguerre, which is like the view of the Boulevard du Temple, it's very often those early views are from top down, okay? Something about the light, something about being able to put the camera on a stand, something that will make it still, okay? Like the daguerreotype is because it's on the window ledge, okay? That view from the Boulevard du Temple, the camera is on the window ledge. About his personality, he's involved in a lot of different scientific institutions throughout his whole life. He published nothing big. There are small leaflets, but he published quite extensively, very diversified. Of course, a few things about his trip to China. I mean, beside his journal is a substantial publication. The one to the right is quite meaningful to me from the region, for people living in Provence. He's somebody who had foreseen the need for the train to bring all the goods from the Alps down to Marseille. So he had published a small leaflet about the need to bring out the goods out of the Alps. And political life, he was actively involved in the political life of the region. He was part of different, he presented, he was conseiller in some office and so on. And he was a recipient, of course, of the Légion d'honneur. The big breakthrough came with that mission to Senegal in 1842, where there was something going on in Saint-Louis in Senegal with the indigo. There was a conflict between the producer and the dealer of indigo. So he was sent there to do an assessment of the situation for the French government. So that was his first overseas mission. What is most important for us from what we see in him today is that he's going to write a journal, and somewhere halfway during his stay in Saint-Louis, he will receive the daguerreotype he had ordered before leaving. And he's going to use the daguerreotype in Saint-Louis. He mentions it twice. And both occasions are, the first one is a view of the main square. So that one, we know it. The second one is, we don't know the image, but he used it for a festival. he used some ethnic human activity. So right away we have that dual perspective, something about landscape, environment, something about human activity, which is something that means what I'm going to touch on in the end. The drawings are from, there was another guy with him, traveling with him on the mission. I forgot his name, it should be there actually. So the drawings are from that companion of travel, but it gives him that vision of text and image coming together to tell a story. Very informal. The journal, we know the journal because, thank God, it was published. There was an exhibition of Itier down by the museum of the Custom Museum in Bordeaux, for which the curator managed to get the manuscript from a descendant, and that was published by the Académie Montesquieu in Bordeaux. And the manuscript is lost since then, but we have at least the text, okay? So the first relation between image and text, that's the daguerreotype of the square, which is in a private collection, and this one I haven't been able yet to trace. I mean, it's very private, one of those very, very private collectors. It's photographed with a sculpture on the staircase of the train station in Marseilles, which is really very emblematic of the role played by Marseille in the colonial history. Back to France after that mission, that was very successful, he's going to be selected for the big one, which is the La Grenée mission, the trip to China to negotiate and sign the Treaty of Whampoa with China. He will be in charge of all the commercial, technical question of the treaty, anything that has to do with trade. And the treaty, the main reason for the treaty is, of course, trade. This is the time when China is like, I mean, the big problem, I mean, the whole reason is that China is offering more things to sell than what Europe has to sell to China. Okay, so there is that imbalance, economic imbalance between those two parts of the world, which is, in fact, the reason behind everything that took place, the Opium War, and so on. And the reason why Singapore is here today, okay, it's like it was to ensure the shipping of opium to China. So he will be, he's sent on that mission, and this is a daguerreotype of Théodose de la Grenée, the ambassador plénipotentiaire. That's his traveling trunk, which is with him. And so this is the trip. It's going to be a 1.5 year long trip. They go to Rio de Janeiro because for maritime reasons, they have to go across the Atlantic in order to go through the Cape of Good Hope with a sailing ship. Okay, they cannot go straight along the coast of Africa. He arrives in Singapore 3rd July 1844. And what's really striking, again, for the purpose of what I'm going to develop as a conclusion, right from the start, at the opening page of his journal, he makes it very clear that he leaves with the intention of making the content of that journey accessible to the public in Europe. So right from, he leaves with the idea of publishing something about that journey. He's like really making use of the experience in Africa to plan what will follow after the trip. And here we go, that daguerreotype from the top of Fort Canning, Bukit Singuntang, Government Hill. It's in the journal, Singapore is the first mention of the use of the daguerreotype. It's most likely that he didn't use the daguerreotype before, because it's 6 months traveling, okay, 6 months sailing in Brazil, in South Africa, in many reasons to use the daguerreotype. He didn't do it probably because he needed to keep the material for the part of the trip that really mattered, which was Asia. Remember that daguerreotype is heavy, expensive. You don't get material very easily yet. So he had to keep as much as possible until he would reach Asia. So it's the first mention of the use of the daguerreotype. Two interesting things in the journal that are very significant of what is going on. Opening of the chapter on Singapore, the ship is anchored next to the ship of Sir Henry Pottinger, who just signed the treaty of the first treaty, the Treaty of Nanking. Okay, Pottinger has just signed the Treaty of Nanking, and he's on his way back to England. And the ship is next to them. And he right away says, I mean, you can see the last sentence. Maybe we too had our own stone to the social edifice rising from the new combinations induced by these contacts between Chinese and European civilizations, and see France accorded a share worthy of its grandeur in this colossal oeuvre. I mean, beat that. Okay? So you see how he's like convinced of that mission. Okay? There's no questioning it. Okay? But at the same time, he's somebody who has a humanist vision of the world. Humanity is one big family to him. And on that one, he's very sincere as well. Okay? So this is the closing of the chapter on Singapore. Today, I took aboard our beautiful frigate several traders from Singapore who were eager to visit it. Nothing varied and curious like this assemblage of people from all nations in my canoe. It was the most accurate expression of Singapore's commercial transformation. Abu Bassa, Arab merchant from Muscat, a wealthy Armenian from Isfahan, a Banyan from Baghdad, Mr. Rutumji, Paris from Bombay, and Wampo. A Chinese merchant had taken their place. He met Wampo. They seemed amazed at everything we were telling them to see. And it's that idea of humankind as one big united family that came to congregate here in Singapore. So after that, the trip proper around the Southeast Asia, Singapore, Manila, Macau, Canton, Sulu, Borneo, a very interesting episode. Java is here, and there's unfortunately no image from Java. What happened? He doesn't mention anything, whether he didn't take the camera when he went to travel or whatever, we don't know. Turan, a very important episode. Gal, which is a place where he stops on his way back alone, he leaves the mission. And 3 daguerreotypes of Pondicherry that were quite puzzling at the start of the research. More about that later. So, and in each place, sometimes he mentions, sometimes he doesn't. There's no mention of the daguerreotypes in Philippines, but we know of 2 daguerreotypes. Macau is, of course, like the big thing, because that's where the treaty is negotiated. It's the first contact with China. And after that, Guangzhou, the big, like the empire opens up. Remember that until very recently, the only place where foreigners could access China was Macau and Wampo. Wampo was the port where all foreign traders had to stop to act and to do their trading with China. Occasionally, the port would open in Guangzhou for a short period of time, but the whole activity was focused in Wampo. The Treaty of Nanking was a big breakthrough because a few other ports along the coast were open to foreigners. So there was that direct input of foreign influence into China. I said, okay, Sulu is a very interesting episode. He mentions the use of the daguerreotype twice. We lost them. We don't know them. That would be really interesting. So it's a banyan tree and a group of horsemen under the banyan tree. The daguerreotypes must be really, really beautiful. They are there for political reasons, to see if France can negotiate something with the local sultan to put a base in Asia. But it's already, Sulu is already a very difficult place as it is today. And there's all those, it's one of the hotspots in Southeast Asia. Da Nang, very important stop for political reason, again, because that's the other. The non-official reason of the mission. Official reason is to sign the treaty. The non-official reason is, oh boy, we haven't got, France realized we haven't got any place that we can call ours in Asia. British have, the Dutch have, we don't have any port where we can safely put the ship and do our business there. So one of the non-official aspects of the mission was to identify possible places where France could eventually set up a base in Asia. And there were not that many possibilities, because lots of the spaces were taken already. That's why Sulu, because the Sultan hadn't paid obedience to the King of Spain. So there was a small window there. And Vietnam was one of the very few, with Thailand, basically, the only country that hadn't really received foreigners in a formal manner. Da Nang on the way back. The part of Egypt, the part of the trip in Egypt was really, really interesting. He doesn't write about it in the journal, but there's a lot of there's 30 over daguerreotypes. This is the number of plates done during the trip. You see that the largest number is done in China, 15 plates in Macau, 28 in Canton. Egypt has 24 plates. The other city is like Singapore still remains one of the most, like 4 plates. It's one of the most numbers of. Back in Marseille, he's back to his custom officer's activity, and he will be a custom officer for the rest of his life. 1847, he do that iconic, I mean, it's really an iconic self-portrait in a Mandarin costume. Today, it's like would be an epitome of appropriation. It's actually a very interesting shot. The way the backdrop, there's something very contemporary. He doesn't bother to have something really properly set up. You know, it's like it has something like very edgy, arty kind of in the mood. 1849, he purchased a property in the south, and near his like family origin. Huh? He purchased a medieval priory, which he turns into a residential place. What is really important that's where he will put his collections. He will store all the things that he brought back from these trips in that property, and he will create a small museum with all those elements, the geology, I mean the stones, and that's where the whole photographic material will be stored as well. He will finish his life in Montpellier. That will be the last posting. He will retire there, and he dies in 1877. Veras will become the property, the residence of his son, and his son redo the self-portrait in the Mandarin costume. And he will keep, I mean, it will be the family residence up until the 1960s when they will sell it to the farmer. And that's where the museum is going to stay. It's going to dissolve. And that's where the photographic material will be found by Gimond.
So Gilles has very carefully laid out the entire life of Itier at this point. And you can see that the research has been very, very thorough. He's actually identified as many of the works that Itier took as possible. But what's actually really interesting about what Gilles discovered is that his research follows on Gimond's research, which was the kind of, I guess, the first scholar of Itier's work. And Gilles found several mistakes in Gimon's work, which he subsequently published in an essay in the history of photography a couple of years ago. So I've asked him to briefly also speak about what these mistakes were and how he found them in his own research.
Yeah, so I mean, Gimon, first of all, he was not a scholar. I mean, it's just like he was a historian, collector, dealer, okay? And the reason for the mistakes is precisely because he was not a scholar, because he didn't see any problem in filling in the blank according to his own imagination, you know, okay, like, poof, and he would write it down with no second thought. And because he was at the same time, you say he was the first scholar of Itier, it was actually because what the research he did on Itier, what he published on Itier, was among the very first material on Asian photography history. So that's his discovery of the whole of the work of Itier, which will be the subject of 3 articles, 2 in French, it was not a journal, it was more of a publication, like, you know, like collection kind of thing. So 2 articles in French. And okay, like for example, it's very clear in the title that he was not a scholar. Jules Itier, le reporter aux 1000 daguerreotypes. Okay. Altogether, there's about 120 something. It becomes 1,000 in the title of the article. Okay, so boom. And you can see that right away. So this is in 1980. 1981, he publishes with History of Photography, which is like the top authority in photo history. And right away, they have a much more, they take out the word reporter out of the title, and they take out the 1,000 daguerreotypes, okay? And in the paper, there were 2 main problems. One problem, because there was one image credited as being from Sulu, Borneo. A guy who was, but there was a problem with that, and the Pondichéry plate were definitely problematic because nowhere was Itier mentioning Pondichéry. As for the daguerreotypes of the Sulu men, and again, a very good example of how much he was not a scholar, the caption of Itier at the back of the plate, because that's one of all the plates are captioned by Itier's handwriting at the back. Eh? So the caption of the plate was Dayak from central Borneo, and the caption of Gimon is Borneo, a Dayak from the central part of the island. It is interesting to know that his man comes from a cannibalistic tribe. Boom. Okay? That's like. And definitely there was something weird with it. The guy was not kind of like an Indian, I mean, somebody coming from the jungle. He was very clearly at ease in his Western styles, clothing. And the problem to me was that kind of setting, that kind of studio setting was not Itier's type of portraiture. There was something weird with that image. As for Pondichéry, there were 3 views of the temple, but captioned by Itier's hand at the back, but he never mentions Pondichéry. The mission never went to Pondichéry, so how could he have 3 images of Pondichéry in the collection? Those were 2 of the things that drove me into the research to. So, no, I thought you were supposed to ask.
Oh, no, so I think the other key discovery that you made for the essay you wrote was also your identification of the earliest photograph of not just Singapore, but Asia. Yeah. So maybe we can talk a bit about that, because that was a very significant kind of
that was my nationalistic, because I'm not Singaporean, but I am Singaporean, okay? That was the nationalistic drive element of the research, which was that could Singapore actually be the place of the coming of photography to Asia? You know, could it be that I could put Singapore on the world map of photography? Why was it that? Okay, as I said, when I started the photography history course, very little material. one key element was the publication of the history of photography in China by Terry Bennett in 2009. And this is when Gilles publishes his paper, there's basically nothing in Europe about Asian photography. And so they are presented as very early daguerreotypes of China. What I discovered after a couple of years on looking into the whole thing is like whatever I could read around would always go back to Gilles article. There had not been any new research on the topic since then. So there was something to do. And with that book, Terry was really coming up with something major, which was that those Itier's daguerreotype were the first daguerreotypes of China. And we have a view of Macau on the cover because it's the first image of China. But Itier mentions the use of the daguerreotype in Singapore before using it in China. So at least that one image of the Tianhokkeng temple predates those from China. So what about the rest? Could there be a possibility for Singapore to be indeed, for that daguerreotype to be really the first existing photograph of Asia? Because from the theory point of view, that's what really matters to me. It's all very well to know that, okay, there was an American doctor who used the daguerreotype thanks to the Abdullah Hikayat Abdullah. It's all very well to know that photography was here in 42. Okay? But what we want is to see the image. We want the physicality of the light of that day in the flow of history. That's what makes a photograph. It's not knowing concept, in an abstract way that photography was here. We want to really see the image. And that resulted in that, quite a major paper. Right? It was like 16,000 words. And it was accepted without any request for correction or amendment in History of Photography, where I was recovering, tidying up. I was looking at what Gilles, because, okay, the article that Gilles had published with History of Photography was the one that people were referencing systematically. So I basically tidied up everything that he had written there, corrected the mistake, and then offered a few new possible interpretation or research. And what I came up to, the main contendant was Philippine, because there was a very widely repeated mention of Damas using the daguerreotype in the Philippines in 42, 43. So you could read it everywhere, no image existing. So what was going on? And eventually, it's a bit too long to go into the topic, but Damas never used the daguerreotype. He was a painter. He was making portraits to make a living as a diplomat in Manila, but he never used the daguerreotype. It's something that the first time that idea came out was in a newspaper, in a Spanish newspaper in the 1920s. And the rest of Asia, it's all very, you see, like China, Vietnam, Sri Lanka are all by Itier. India, there is a small window. There are calotypes in a journal dated between 43 and 45. The date of the calotype is not clearly identified, so something maybe blurred there. Indonesia is 45, Japan 50s, Korea 60s. So there was very clearly the Tianhokkeng daguerreotype described in the journal, 6 July 44, is the earliest dated photograph of Asia. And it makes perfect sense because it's arts meets sciences, East meets West. It's really that point of configuration of. So here is the daguerreotype, long story. We know of it, thank God, because of one publication. There was only one publication before. in the catalogue of that exhibition in Bordeaux. And this is what, it's a very short description. Itier never really goes into detail about his shooting. It's somewhere.
It's in a private collection.
Huh?
It's in a private collection.
It's in a private collection. And I was saying that one, because in the journal he goes up to pay to say hello to who was it? I always Mountbatten? No. Who was the resident then? Anyway, he goes up to Government Hill on the 4th of July. The following, he had 4 stays in Singapore. All of them are excursions outside the city. Would have he, I mean, is there a possibility for him to go back on top of the government later on? Sorry.
Take your time. So you're saying that, so right now, I mean, for those of you who didn't catch it, so we think the Tien Hock King Temple daguerreotype is the earliest photograph made in Asia, but this might potentially be 1 or 2 days before. Yeah.
2 days before.
But we are not sure because we don't know the exact date that this was taken.
Because after that, he uses the daguerreotype at the beginning. Every time in each city, it's during the first stay that he uses it. So, I mean, that's something that, so you might have, so that makes everything
So
exciting.
we might have the
You
earliest,
might have the earliest dated photograph
of Asia.
Aren't you lucky?
Because this one is international.
Suddenly, in just like a few seconds, I increased the value of your piece by woof. I mean, I think, can I have a commission, please? And incidentally, that would make, just as that one of the could be, blah, blah, because again, that view of 2 Malay person in the street is not dated, not described. It's probably taking place during that first week, in July 44, and it would be the first photograph of Asian person. Now, the question mark about the 2 images, and see, interestingly enough, the problematic images are all gathered in the Wilson collection in London. Okay, the Wilson Center is it's one of the main private photo collections in the world, and they have, I think they have 6 daguerreotypes from Itier. And they have the main problematic one. What happened with Pondicherry is that a miracle happened, which is that a lady doing a PhD on Edmund Paris, who was the commandant of a steamer, there were 3 boats making the Lagone mission, 2 sailing boats that left end of December 43. End of December 43. And 1 steamer that was the commercial mission, where there were the representatives of commercial industry and so on, who left spring 44, because the boat was faster. Okay? Edmund Paris was the commandant of the steamer. He was a very good draftsman who had already published books on maritime architecture from around the world. He became eventually the first director of the Navy Museum in Paris, and he's regarded as one of the inventors of maritime anthropology. Okay? And Paris had in mind to carry on his work as a researcher and so on during that trip, and he asked the Navy to provide him with a daguerreotype. And he left for the mission with a daguerreotype thinking that he would use the daguerreotype to make sketches that he would transcribe into drawings. All this was discovered by that lady doing the PhD on Paris, because she was in the museum the day the family brought the journal, the manuscript journal, to leave it with the museum. And the people at the counter said, hey, okay, we just received that, take it now, reproduce it now, I mean, take the photo to study it now, because once we put it into the process of registration, blah, 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 it's not going to come out before at least 1 or 2 years. And she got it, she photographed it, and there, in the pages of the journal, there was the whole explanation to the story. They had stopped in Pondicherry on the way to Singapore. Paris himself, because the daguerreotype was too complicated to use, but there were some guys who started using it for him, and there is a whole description of the shooting of those 3 plates in the Tiruvakkarai temple, which I could identify thanks to the office of the École Française d'Extrême-Orient in Pondicherry. And we know that, it's again for India, this one, we have an exact date by the day, 22 July 1844, which makes them really the earliest dated photograph of India. And the word dated is very important because it's like by the day, okay? The other daguerreotypes are between 43, 44. As for our dear cannibalist, who's not a cannibalist, my explanation is that it might well be a daguerreotype from du Tronquoy.
Who was the earliest photographer to set up a studio in Singapore? But we don't have any surviving images of him, so we don't know if it is or it's not, but it might be.
It might be, because, okay, the reason why I'm saying this is because du Tronquoy was set up, okay, we know about the studio because of an advertising. He was also running the Hotel de Londres, Hotel of London. Okay, he was actually from Belgium. He was not French, he was from Belgium, and he had set up a hotel of good standard for visitors to Singapore. And the hotel was right somewhere around here, like right at the foot of Fort Canning, okay? So he had the hotel and the studio together. The image is, it could be from the Philippines, something a bit Filipino in the mood somehow. But Singapore was already that place of, that crossroad. Visitors were coming, and there was the beginning of a market for people wanting to take back images from what they were visiting. Okay? So du Tronquoy might have been one of those early studios offering exotic view of the places visited.
Yes. And Itier stayed in du Tronquoy's hotel.
Itier stayed in that hotel. So Itier might have bought that daguerreotype from du Tronquoy. I think it's the most likely explanation. Because for the Philippines, we know that, because there was all that thing about, photography was in Manila by 1842. It's not true. There's something Gimon mentions, Itier buying plates in Manila, but I noticed, I couldn't really come down to the core of it, but there's some discrepancy with the dates. There's something not clear that. So I don't see a studio in Manila at that time. But we know there was a studio in Singapore. So there's something there that points in that direction.
So Gilles, it's 12 o'clock.
You want to leave?
No, I want to give them a chance to ask questions.
You want to leave?
Okay, you can decide what
you were so long with your introduction. Right?
Indeed, 5 minutes. So I was going to ask, you want to finish up this section?
So the images of China, I really like the Praia Grande, and that's like really interesting. An important point is his portraiture style, and that's why the Dayak doesn't fit. All his portraits have a very plain white background, all of them. Why would he have suddenly something with all this kind of paraphernalia? It's really strange. And this one is very modern in the style. Very important image taken in the street in Canton, which has a very ethnographic style. Okay, the people are posed in such a way that they are very clearly front profile. Okay, it's very clearly planned that way. The first known use of the profile position for ethnographic purpose takes place in August 1844 in Paris with some South American Indian at the request of the Institute to document those visitors to Paris. Itier left Paris in December 43. He left France in December 43. No way he could know about that vision of a profile photograph, that way to objectify the subject. He does it spontaneously in the street in Canton. Another image, a very interesting image, is the trader Durand, who was actually an opium dealer, and Kum Chu, who was the majordome, the servant of one of the aristocrats in the Chinese. So the two of them side by side. The first photograph of an Asian Western person side by side together. The world is getting smaller. The story with Lam Qua is also a very interesting one. Lam Qua was that famous, he was like the famous Chinese painter at that time. It was an important part of the Canton trade, the decoration of objects with the Chinese-style paintings. In particular, the making of miniature portraits. And that's something all over the world. There was little miniature portraits put in very delicate little Morocco boxes. When Itier used the daguerreotype in the street in Canton, all the miniaturists in Canton, something is going on. Our trade is going to be subjected to a change. Here, that guy is drawing. There's an apparatus that can draw by itself. What is going on? The news reached Lam Qua, who visits Itier to ask him for a demonstration. Itier obliges. He makes a daguerreotype of Lam Qua, which he offers to Lam Qua. And 2 weeks later, Lam Qua comes back with a painting, miniature, a reproduction of the daguerreotype, which he gifts to Itier. And this is something really, it's really remarkable because we have a meeting of two individuals that exchange techniques that really are emblematic of the revolution happening around the world, and at the same time, the meeting of the two parts of the world. Unfortunately, both are lost. We know the image by an illustration of it in an article done for the exhibition presenting the objects brought back by the mission. The panorama is an important part, 360-degree panorama of Canton, which I reconstituted for the first time. And it's, again, the first 360-degree panorama in the world. Not the one that was done, okay, because it's the first one existing. There was one done of London in 42, but the daguerreotypes are lost. So all this is making, you see, we have that documentation of the mission in very detail. I mean, like really, there's that idea of the event happening, the very official photograph of the event. All things that really indicate a concept of reportage. If you add to this that kind of image, like coming from the street, you have all those things, you see, like those are the three daguerreotypes of Singapore: cultural, political, societal. The topics of reportage. And finally, the image of Da Nang, which is one image in which Itier foresees the political future of Indochina. He uses the camera in a very eventful manner. They are about to leave Da Nang. They went there to negotiate the liberation of the bishop of the Missions Étrangères. He has to be taken on land to because he hasn't taken any photograph yet, just when the boat is about to leave. And he mentions, there's only two daguerreotypes, and he mentions the two daguerreotypes in the book. That's quite unusual. The daguerreotype itself is like really nothing successful, okay? Yet, it's the one that is used as illustration for volume 3. Because it has a very clear purpose to show the political future presence of France in Vietnam. In the book, he mentions a few regiments of infantry would suffice to complete the conquest. We take Da Nang, we cut the north from the south, we control the country. And indeed, it will be published, the illustration will be published in Illustration a few years later. And indeed, 10 years after the publication in the Illustration, that's exactly what will happen. The French would attack Da Nang with the Spanish, and that will be the beginning of French Indochina. So it's an image that has a very steps of what will make reportage 50 years, good 50 years later. So, if we take that very clear indication of his intention at the start and what was produced eventually in the long run with all that material, I think there is no problem about making him the inventor of reportage. Because if you look at the history, I mean, it's very unclear, okay? The history of reportage is not written as such. What do you call reportage to begin with? Is it photojournalism? Is it documentation? Is it... So what we can see is there is that fantastic journey of de Pranger between 42, 46 around the Mediterranean, 1,000 other daguerreotypes, but no event, okay? So it's purely documentation. The New Haven fishermen community by Hill and Adamson, again, it's a documentation. The first photograph used for illustration as a news, it's 1848, it's during the Commune in Paris, okay? 1850s, it's the Egypt. People start traveling to Egypt. And there's the Mission Hélographique in France in 51. And the first real war reportage, which is, of course, Roger's Fenton documentation of the Crimean War. Nothing compares. Nothing compares to the full scope of the work that he produced during the trip and after the trip. So, conclusion, yes. I think that's okay. I managed to establish my non-nationalistic pride. I managed to put Singapore on the world map of photography because that's the earliest dated photograph of Asia. That's where reportage was invented. That's the next step. It's going to be a big one.
Yes, so that's actually what Gilles, I think, is going to work on next in terms of writing. And
there's another one on the Egypt.
yeah.
I didn't touch on that because there's a whole question about what he did in Egypt on the way back. And the first photograph of the pyramid. There's a whole question. So that's the next one because we already paid for the conference in Athens and then COVID came in. But yeah, I mean, that's going to be the next step.
Yeah, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I'm not sure if your slides are still going on. Okay, no, because I want to let anyone who has burning questions to ask.
This one is it's a portrait. We don't know where the original is. It's a reproduction, which is with the museum in Gap, which I found when I finally started interacting with the museum in Gap. It's a beautiful portrait of him. It's like really, I guess it's like just a few years before he's passing on. And he seems like a really cool, happy, contented old man, you know, like he had a good life.
He did.
Well, you know.
Okay.
Questions?
Yes, so I do want to give people a chance to ask questions if they have any, but I also know that Gilles knows quite a few of you, so
go and drink coffee.
You can also, have a coffee with him after. But you can see, like, he's really done intensive research on this figure, a very important figure.
I mean, okay. I have three main works, three main body of works. Okay, the first one is on Bintan. Second one is what I did for the master with that castle in that childhood village, blah blah blah. And the third one is this one. All three of them, the work is my life. There's no differentiation between the work, the topic, the involvement. Each three of them involves me as a full being, spiritually, emotionally, blah, blah, blah. So it's more than a research, actually. It's a
practice.
It's a practice. It's a way of being. It's a way of being. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're going to end it here. Thank you very much, Gilles. Gilles, this is one of Gilles'
This is my...
Yes, I feel that I should mention, so Gilles is actually leaving Singapore to go back to France in July. So this is almost, I think maybe it might be his final public talk in Singapore. So we're very happy to have him at the gallery to do this. Thank you.